Hello, viewers. I'm David Blakesley. I'm a contributor to CriterionCast.com. Corporate logo, branding opportunity there. And I do podcasting, and I've blogged and just basically been a contributor to that site for quite a few years now, as well as my own old blog, Criterion Reflections. I'm here to do another one of my Criterion Reactions videos, which I did a few of them back in 2019. It's been a while. I've had good intentions ever since. I'm here back at it to see how it goes and if I really do get comfortable with this video format. But the reason I'm here today is I have an opportunity. I was supposed to be podcasting this morning with a couple friends about my favorite Criterion collection releases of 2020, but those plans fell through, so I have an open time slot. So I thought, well, I have put some work and some thought into this, so let's just go ahead and make a short video where I can explain to you, whoever's bothering to take a look here, what I thought were the best Criterion releases of this past half a year. I'm in kind of late July. We kind of looked at this as kind of a first 6 months of Criterion review. Obviously, we're a little bit past that now, but I'm going to kind of stick with my original selections, even though there's been several titles released in this month of July that I think are very worthy of consideration and probably will at least make the running in my year-end best of list, even though we've got some pretty incredible stuff coming up along the way between now and December. So let me just kind of start with kind of a general assessment. Where is the Criterion collection at these days? This has been a good year, an excellent year actually. A lot of really interesting stuff has been released, and it's just been a really fun journey as I continue to track all the things that Criterion puts in front of their fan base, their audience, the collectors out there, as well as people who are just looking for very high quality Blu-rays and DVDs, if they're still collecting that format, from one of the best publishing houses out there as far as home cinema is concerned. Now, there's also an axiom here in that every year that goes by that Criterion releases a bunch of movies, that means there's that many fewer great movies to choose from that they can release, with the very limited exception of movies that have just more recently been made and are just now becoming available for them to consider. So I see this 2020 collection so far as really more like filling different niches and bringing less familiar films to the forefront. You compare some of the classics of years past with films that have been released this year. I mean, I think it's hard for Criterion to compete against itself. If you want to say, is this the best year ever or not? I've actually seen people who've said, yeah, this is by far their best, or things to that effect. It's like, well, I think that's going a little bit, hyperbolic. But I'm not complaining. I'm just saying, this year's releases have a lot of interesting, whether you want to call them obscurities or lesser titles, relatively more, specialized interest type of things. That's been part of the trend even in recent years. So I have no problem with that. I think they're doing a great job of kind of resurrecting titles that maybe have been forgotten or neglected for a long time, and they're doing that through putting together very impressive editions. So when you think about what are the best releases in terms of sheer film quality, I think there's actually a very convincing case that can be made that Criterion's reissues that have come out since the beginning of this year could be like their top 5. I've got a little stack of them right here. Really, any combination of these 6 titles could be a very convincing best of the year type of lineup. So let me just kind of take a look at the re-releases that I think merit top consideration as some of the very best films that Criterion has published with a 2020 copyright date. This one's pretty recent, The Lady Eve, a great screwball romantic comedy from the 1940s. Henry Fonda, Barbara Stanwyck, of course. Really hilarious. Preston Sturges, classic director. This is a reissue. Tokyo Olympiad, even though it came out in the big Olympics box set a couple years ago, and had its own kind of rare and highly sought after DVD edition. This is a very impressive film, fully worthy of a standalone release, just because of the artistry and the significance of what it captures, both in the Olympic movement, the re-entry of Japan as a peer nation among the leading countries, societies of the world, and all of that, and just a really beautifully made um, you know artwork by Kani Chikawa. Salesman is a film I really love. I think it captures so much that's really essential about the United States of America and its society, its culture, its civilization, if you will. Uh, some people would say it's kind of comical or lightweight. Others, of course, would say it's very tragical and very kind of gloomy and depressing. And it captures all of those emotions quite brilliantly in its story of hard-pressed salesman, Bible salesman in this case, very beaten down by the economic pressures and the manipulations of the people who are their bosses, and the way they kind of pass that manipulation along on the unfortunate recipients of their sales pitches. The Cranes Are Flying, another beautiful, powerful work of Soviet cinema. It was kind of buried there in the DVD only lineup, a really visually beautiful and emotionally challenging and profound work of art from the USSR. Very happy to see that reissued so that people who wouldn't have really considered getting that old DVD edition, kind of a bare bones release, get this one and really marvel at the incredible artistry of Kalatozov and his crew. And then there's Army of Shadows. It's the Melville film. Really powerful statement about the French resistance in the World War II years. It's been in and out of print. It came back. This is actually the 2010 first edition, not the 2020 first edition that Criterion put out earlier this year, but that's my copy. I don't know that I really need to buy the new Blu-ray, but it's excellent that today's buyers have an opportunity to get it without having to pay the crazy bootleg prices. So that's 5 individual disc releases. This one here, Eric Romer's 6 Moral Tales, in that's Blu-ray packaging, could clearly be seen as the release of the year, I think, in many respects, although there are some bigger box sets, both that have been issued since and are forthcoming that may outdo it. But this was a really important release for the Criterion Collection. It was the first with the iconic C logo. And even though I do miss the beautiful individual digipacks that each film got, even those little short ones at the beginning of the series, I'm, really happy again that these have been upgraded, that they are now readily accessible. This set's been out of print for a little while. And definitely was kind of a heartbreaker that just like Spine Number 1, which still is out of print, this introduction of the wacky C logo, as well as the quality of the films themselves, was kind of hard to obtain for people maybe more recently getting into the Criterion Collection. So well overdue, highly deserved, and these are really magnificent films by a great director, and really happy to have this back in the collection with all the high definition restoration and all that's been done. However, even though that's a pretty valid and strongly defensible top 5 or even 6, that's not my criteria. That's not what I've decided to go with. I'm just going to go with new titles that just entered the collection this year. And I didn't even mention some of the Laserdisc titles like Showboat and The Prince of Tides, and there might be 1 or 2 others. I can't remember at the moment. But so Criterion's been bringing back some of their old stuff, getting it out there for today's viewers and buyers. So good on them for kind of getting the old stuff in front of us. But like I say, I'm going to limit my selections to the films that maybe spoke most personally to me. But before I get into that, let me talk about what might be very worthy best of from a sort of a product or packaging standpoint, because we've had some really impressive editions released already this year as well. So here's my shelf. You can see the Criterion 2020 lineup starts right here with Holiday. Goes through Le Pete Soldat, Failsafe, All About My Mother, Teorema, Roma, Three Fantastic Journeys by Carl Zeman, Paris is Burning, Bamboozled, and Leave Her to Heaven. And then, do a little camera work here, over to Showboat, Prince of Tides, The Cremator, Desiree Rides Again, The Grand Budapest Hotel, Me and You and Everyone We Know, The Great Escape, Husbands, Scorsese Shorts, Wildlife, An Unmarried Woman, The Cameraman, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Come and See, Bruce Lee, His Greatest Hits, War of the Worlds, and Marriage Story, which I think is everything that's actually been commercially released up until this point. Maybe there's a few folks who have some preview discs that have already been sent out to reviewers and such, but I think, ta-da, that's everything that Criterion's put out on the store shelves, along with the reissues that I've already referenced so far this year. So another top five, an alternate top five we could consider would be something like, the Bruce Lee set. I mean, good grief. What a collection. What a beautiful, package. Very comprehensive. It's a real one of a kind. Now there were, not that long ago, the idea of Bruce Lee films in the Criterion Collection was just a complete non sequitur. It doesn't make sense. These are not Criterion type of movies, right? But now they are, because they are reaching into some new territory. You got the Carl Zeman box. Let's just have some fun with that a minute, right? You got the little die cut packaging. Settle down. You've got the very beautiful inserts here. And just, again, gorgeous artwork. Very fun. Pop-ups. Very, very creative. I mean, they put some real work into this. Spent a little bit of money to make these films that might not be familiar to a lot of viewers. Very appealing. Love this set. We are going to be talking about it on my podcast called Inside the Box in the foreseeable future. Trevor Barrett and I, we do a series where we talk about box sets by the Criterion Collection, and this is one that's on the short list to be covered pretty soon. I like these films, had a lot of fun with them, good times, but I did not choose them as one of my top five. And so, maybe I can explain that. I don't think they're bad by any means, but they're just not in that cut. But that's a beautiful addition and could be seen as one of the best things that Criterion's done this year. You look at films like Roma and Marriage Story. Beautiful packages. Pretty famously, these are films available on Netflix, which a lot of us subscribe to, including myself, and can be viewed, quote unquote, for free for every one of us who've factored that monthly Netflix bill into our budget. But Criterion took it to a different level, put in lots of really nice supplements that you're not going to see on Netflix, along with beautiful slipcase packaging. Just, really did it up. Very excellent, very deluxe editions that I think make those purchases very strongly worth considering, even if you can watch the film and have watched the film multiple times without having to put an extra nickel in the cash register. And then you've got something like, the Grand Budapest Hotel. I mean, every Wes Anderson release is just kind of like a smorgasbord of fun and games and inserts and goodies, postcards, little pamphlets, magazines. What's not to love about this, right? It's a fantastic addition that, Criterion did it right. And so, props to them, props to Wes Anderson for working out this arrangement. He just kind of keeps topping himself in terms of the elaboration of the productions that he puts together. And Criterion returns the favor by saying, okay, let's up our game just a little bit more with each successive release. So, Grand Budapest Hotel, a beautiful piece of merchandise to bring home. But I just decided I'm not going to let packaging overshadow my decisions as far as what were my most meaningful, personally enjoyable, impactful films that I've watched from the Criterion Collection so far in the first half of this year. So, with all those caveats aside, let's get into my top 5, shall we? My first one is Pier Paolo Pasolini's Teorema. Now, this has taken some grief for its very pedestrian cover, and there's a lot of people who don't even seem to like the film all that much. I think it's pretty fascinating, and I think it does kind of fit the spot of Criterion's long-standing tradition of releasing great Euro art house classics by the great directors of various new waves, people who really took cinema into new directions back in the 50s and 60s when the art house movement was kind of at its prime, at its peak. So Pasolini is a director I've been kind of more recently delving into. In my Criterion Reflections podcast, we're talking about the trilogy of life. We've already covered the Decameron, and we've also got the Arabian Nights, and what's the other one? The Canterbury Tales coming up. I can't remember which order they're in, but they'll be covered in future seasons. But I really find Pasolini very fascinating, full of ideas, complexity. He's a man of great internal contradictions and tensions, and he just seems to bring all of that out in his art. And so this fills a very important spot in his filmography. I love the cast. Terence Stamp, this enigmatic figure. He was very young at the time, very sexy and beguiling and kind of hypnotic and all of that. And the impact that he has on this bourgeois Italian family. So, we've got really wonderful cast. Silvana Mangano and Anne Wiazemski in particular. Really enjoy watching them do their thing. Anne was, of course, the girl in Bresson's Au Hasard Balthazar. She was also Godard's wife after he split up with Anna Karina. And Silvana Mangano, a great favor, or maybe it's Mangiano, maybe I'm mistaken there, but she's a great, kind of iconic figure herself. Pasolini worked with her, as well as Visconti and many others. She made her debut back in the early 50s in Bitter Rice as a bit of a sex object, but she's much more complex and multifaceted than just her looks might draw us to it originally. So I'm just glad to have this one. I did enjoy it. I found it pretty challenging, worthy of reconsideration. Kind of wished it had come up or been released earlier so I could have covered it in my podcast. But again, this is just kind of a good filled in a missing spot. And, I really like music or movies from this era. This is a 68 release. 1968 release. Ennio Morricone's soundtrack as well has kind of some cool funky rock bits to it, as well as other moods and textures. The symbolism can be a little bit, heavy-handed perhaps for some tastes, a little bit garish even, but I really like this kind of thing. So I think it was great that Criterion got that out there for us. The next one, my number 4, kind of fits that same spot in terms of filling a place that I really sensed was kind of a void that needed to be kind of filled in. And this is John Cassavetes' Husbands. Not that the Cassavetes box set isn't big enough already, but when you look at the films in that lineup, and if you know his filmography, Husbands seemed like a very significant missing piece. And so we have it finally, which is great. Um, this is a movie that I wouldn't necessarily say is as enjoyable on certain levels. I mean, again, some people might really dig it. For me, it was kind of upsetting, kind of disturbing, because it's basically the story of three American men kind of, just taking their open, unfettered assholery to the next level. One of their friends dies. There's kind of a foursome of four buddies that are pretty tight, pretty well knit, bonded, good time fellas of the suburban American type of its era, 1970. One of them passes away unexpectedly, much too young, and that sort of sends the three survivors of this little quartet off the rails. And it's basically their saga of a lost weekend. Um, Boy, what do I say about that? I mean, especially so spur of the moment like this. I don't know. I just saw a lot of my own growing up reflected in this. Men that my dad associated with, and that my dad was kind of one of those guys. And it was just an ethos that was in the air at the time, and it made an impact on me both for good and for not so good. And this film just sort of portrays that mindset, that sense of entitlement, that sense of um, the feeling that the world owes them when they are actually so privileged and so self-centered. It's just a really revealing portrait of a time and a place and a way of life, a mindset that I think still needs to be grappled with, because these guys are, in many sense, still kind of running our society. They're older now, and of course, Cassavetes himself is dead and gone and no longer with us. But that sense of that, like I say, that sense of entitlement, power, privilege, self-absorption, and an obliviousness to the pain and hardship that their arrogance creates for other people is all on display here, as well as their own sort of unique form of self-pity and feeling like, despite all of the, options that they can enjoy and engage with in life, that somehow they're coming out on the short end of things. Yeah, just a very fascinating portrayal. And the funny thing is, I'm not even sure how much even Cassavetes got it as far as how out of place or far from what should be normal life his portrayal was. Uh, in the supplements, Ben Gazzara is just talking about what a fun time they had and what a great bunch of guys they were. He's clearly much older at this point when he's being interviewed and looking back. So there is that touch of nostalgia, but I don't know. I mean, it's like there's a certain glamorization of what's really a very unrighteous and kind of flawed and corrupted way of living. That's being embraced in some respects, but you just have to watch it with a critical eye and let the movements of these characters and the way they treat the women in their lives and other people, let that sink in and think about, boy, what does that say about attitudes and presumptions that a lot of husbands, a lot of men bring into their relationships even now, because these traditions have been passed on, and they're still doing damage and still leaving deep impressions on people who come into contact with these folks. So pretty powerful film, and one I'm really, really glad that Criterion has given us to enjoy. Yeah, there's a pretty fascinating backstory to the making of this film as well. The supplements cover a lot of that, but I'll just leave it at that for now. Okay, number 3. I'm going to go with The Cremator. In some ways, this feels like a film I've already kind of processed and moved on from. I actually covered this in my podcast. This was a 1969 film. In season 1 of Criterion Reflections, I talked about this film with Martin Kessler, because at the time it was available on the Criterion channel. And as you may know, my podcast covers all Criterion related films, whether they're on disc or on the streaming services, or whatever. So I didn't, of course, have this edition, but I'm really super happy that Criterion has made this film more widely available for home media collectors. It also has the director George Hertz's debut film, The Junk Shop, which is another nice addition, also available on the channel. But this is a very visually powerful and unforgettable film in so many ways. It's a precursor to some of the kind of more fascistic, totalitarian vibes that maybe we're picking up these days in the USA and throughout the West as strongman governments take over and wield their influence on ordinary schleps like the titular figure here. When I reviewed The Cremator, in fact, I think it was not even permanently available. I think it had already gone off the channel for some time. So I actually have this copy, which is I think a Czech DVD that I ordered. And just to kind of show you the packaging here, it's in an envelope. And so I went to all the expense of ordering this thing for just a few bucks off eBay. Got this little disc and this little flimsy packaging. Now I'm not going to get rid of this. This is a nice little keepsake. This is how the film was available to people in its kind of native region there. But this Blu-ray is the stuff. Highly recommended. And then after you've watched it, go back to season 1 of my podcast and listen. It's one of the earliest episodes, maybe like episode 2 or 3 even. A really excellent film. Maybe one of the very best that Criterion's released on a sheer quality, poignancy perspective. I really, really like The Cremator. And you can hear a lot more of my thoughts, like I said, in my podcast. So we're getting up there now. Number 2 is, this one definitely hits home. Spike Lee's Bamboozled. This is a really important film that, of course, connects to the ongoing conversation about Black Lives Matter, about just kind of institutional racism in our society, by particularly focusing on racism in media and popular culture. It's a movie that, while it does have its laughs and its lighter side, it's pretty heavy, pretty blunt, pretty confrontational, offensive, upsetting, aggravating, agitating. I mean, you could throw a lot of adjectives at this film, but it needs to be reckoned with if you really want to take stock of what's happened in American society for a very, very long time. I probably don't want to ramble on too long, but it's a very, very important film, and one that really stirred up a lot of thoughts on me as a young person growing up in the 1960s. That was an era where the kind of racism and exploitation and mockery and buffoonery of people of color, of African American people in particular, was still pretty mainstream and didn't really get a lot of attention from the adults who were in charge of programming TV for children like myself. So I would see the Little Rascals. I would see the racist gags in Looney Tunes cartoons or other types of old vintage media. I thought that stuff was funny. I remember hearing, even later on, many years after the fact, radio skits of Amos and Andy and Stepin Fetchit and Rochester, Jack Benny's butler and stuff. And it's just like, I just thought that was just kind of funny stuff of the way black people express themselves and the stereotypes. And I didn't have the filters or the assistance to interpret just how crude and dehumanizing those images were. Obviously, I came to understand that stuff later on in life, and I grew up, and I've had to do my own work to become more consciously anti-racist, and kind of filter out and understand some of those underlying assumptions that were planted in me at a young age. Your experience probably will be a lot different depending on your age, your education, all that. But I just really appreciate the courage of Spike Lee and his cast in going where they went with this film. And as a release, it's got a lot of other fantastic supplements that continue that conversation and really unpack, what's going on here in Bamboozled, because a lot of people, I'm sure, like I say, could just get easily offended by the crude stereotypes, but they need to see it through, especially to that closing montage of images much too familiar to me that I think it's not been resolved. We haven't settled it yet, but I appreciate Criterion putting this film, because it's not the most cinematically beautiful, especially with the video digital work that was being done at the time. There are some great cinematic passages shot on 16 millimeter film stock, but this isn't one for the aesthetics of cinema as a visual medium. Although the visuals are very powerful, there's a lot of truth here, and there's a lot of sorrowful, sad, regrettable history going on. And that's what's being discussed here, even as he takes those stereotypes and puts them in the then current contemporary context. So hats off to Spike and to Criterion for, setting this in front of us. The Bamboo Sled from the 2019 Wacky Drawing Clue cartoon finally making its debut in 2020. So that was my number 2. So here's my number 1. You might be surprised at this, but I'm going to go with Paul Mazursky's An Unmarried Woman, starring Jill Clayburgh. This is a film I saw way back when it first came out. At the time, things like Kramer versus Kramer, Woody Allen's Manhattan, and Annie Hall before that, and probably other films. You could even go with All That Jazz. These characters who were in the process of kind of screwing up their lives and making big mistakes and then having to live with it. In this film, Jill Clayburgh, the unmarried woman, doesn't really make the big mistake herself. It's her husband who does. And he messes up pretty bad and ruins what was apparently a pretty satisfying marriage with a very stupid, again, self-indulgent, husbands-like fling with a younger woman. And this movie is about Jill Clayburgh's response to this unexpected crisis in her life. And wow, what an incredible performance. I think that's really why I made this my number 1 movie of the year. Jill Clayburgh is just so wonderful and so affecting, so heartbreaking, and such just a wonderful free spirit, even as she endures a lot of pain. And so there's the story of the character, but there's also just Jill Clayburgh herself, a really luminous presence, and just kind of fell in love with her as a performer and even as a person, as I kind of understood more about the story of the making of this film, who she was, and just kind of what she represented, how she expressed herself, and how this role just kind of gave her just such a showcase to demonstrate her own gifts and just to tell the story that a lot of other women went through during the course of the 70s, and I'm sure have gone through their own versions of that in all the years ever since. So yeah, I don't have a ton more of eloquent commentary to say about An Unmarried Woman, except that it really touched me on a really personal level, just because it connected to the kind of my own life experience of what I was going through in my own family at that time. And I just love the humanity of this particular film. So yeah, it's maybe not the biggest earth-shaking type of movie. It's not like a come and see, which I have not yet seen. So that's one thing that might still make my top 5, top 10, whatever list. I've never bothered watching Come and See because I heard the transfer on the Criterion channel wasn't all that good, and I figured they would be releasing it eventually. And then when the Barnes and Noble sale opened up, they were already sold out by the time I got to the store. So I've since gotten my copy, but I just decided I'm going to go ahead and get to that a little bit later. Maybe it doesn't seem like a summertime movie. I might even wait till the fall before I get into it, just to let that experience hit me with all the ferocity that I'm expecting it to. So that's one that's kind of in reserve for right now. So those are my top 5. I hope you enjoyed hearing my rambling thoughts. And so here's my Criterion Reactions video. We'll see when I get around to doing one of these again. Thanks for checking it out, everybody. This is David Blakesley, signing off.